his desire to preach as kind of a transition and a segue into this part. So follow along as I read verses 16 and 17 in Romans chapter 1. Paul writes, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For in the gospel a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." So as we come to these verses, and we've come out of verse 15 where Paul has expressed his eagerness to preach the gospel to these Roman believers, we see this transition because he's saying, well, I'm so eager to preach to you. Why? Because I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Why am I not ashamed of the gospel? Because of these things. But the interesting thing in noting about, as Paul does this, that Paul's expressing, as he says he's not ashamed, he's really expressing a pride. And so in these two verses, we see Paul sharing his pride in proclaiming the gospel. And why do we see the pride? Okay, well, when Paul writes, "For I am not ashamed," and I love this. This is a part of hermeneutics when we first took preaching classes in college or in seminary. But there's a figure of speech called litotes. Okay, I don't expect you to ever remember that word. But litotes is a figure of speech where somebody uses a double negative to emphasize their point. They kind of use an understatement to emphasize something. There's even a little bit of sarcasm in there, but just a little bit. But the point when I say a double negative, he says, I am not ashamed. And ashamed has a negative attachment to it, right? A negative meaning. So he says, not ashamed. Well, if you're not ashamed, then what are you? You're proud. Okay? It's the same if, I looked at a couple of funny examples trying to figure out something to emphasize this figure of speech. If I were to say, well, she's not bad looking, what am I really saying? She's really good looking, okay? She's not bad on the eyes. It's the same type of feeling. The other one that I really liked was, if I can find it in my notes here, not too bad. My wife makes something for me to eat, and I say, well, that's not too bad, okay? I don't really mean that but it's a fun way of saying it's really good. Now some people might be saying, well, it's not great, but it's not too bad either. But for the most part, if we say something's not too bad, it's a fun way of saying that it's really good. So see, when Paul says, I'm not ashamed, he's really saying, I'm proud to proclaim the gospel. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. But one reason I think that he uses it, and other theologians and Bible teachers agree, is that Paul was writing to these Roman believers, okay? They lived in Rome. You know anything about Rome during this time period? I love what one pastor wrote about this when he was explaining this sense of Rome. Pastor Ray Pritchard, and he said, this is Rome. Rome. The heart of the empire, Rome. City of philosophers and poets, Rome. Home to every conceivable idol, Rome. Seat of emperor worship, Rome. Center of intellectual arrogance, Rome. City built on war, Rome. And you want me to tell people about Jesus in this town? You see, the Christians there were looked upon as either jokes, or they were associated with the Jewish people, so they were seen as a threat, and they were seen as kind of strange. They were also looked upon as a threat to the emperor himself, to Nero, because it was all about emperor worship. And you're going to worship somebody else, you're going to worship God, then you're pushing the envelope just a little too much. So when Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, there's a part of it he's trying to get across to these Roman believers. Are you ashamed of the gospel? Are you proud of it, even in the world in which you live. And it's kind of his way of reminding them, and as I look at it, to remind us of our responsibility as believers. The Great Commission, Matthew 28, verses 19 and 20. You got that up there? Therefore, go and do what? Make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And he reminds us by saying, and surely I am with you always, even to the very end of the age. But that's our responsibility. That's what we call the Great Commission. Okay? So, as Paul is talking about his pride in proclaiming the gospel, what he's really saying to his audience and to us is he wants us to go back and hit your point there, to be proud to share your faith. Be proud to share your faith. Okay? Are we? What about us today? Are we ashamed? Are we lazy? Are we scared? You know, it's interesting. You know, you can always find statistics to prove pretty much anything you want to prove, right? But there's a group, and perhaps you've heard of them, called the Barna Group, which specifically does things related to religion and Christianity in the United States. And they spend hours, they have a whole team that places calls, and I don't know if any of you have ever been contacted by them or you've done any surveys, but they'll call and they'll ask people what they think about certain things. And this particular study that they did back in 2013 was specifically related and addressed towards so-called or self-claimed born-again Christians. Okay, of all the people, there were thousands of them, that they did these in-depth interviews with, 73% of born-again Christians said yes. When asked if they have a personal responsibility to share their faith with others, they agreed. They said, yes, I do. Okay? If I look around this room and I think most of us in here are born-again Christians, I would hope the percentage would be a little higher than 73%. Okay? But let's just say 73% of born-again Christians say, yes, I believe it is my personal responsibility to share my faith with others. The amazing thing is, of those that they address, though, when the conviction is put into practice, the numbers shift drastically downward. Then there was 52% of born-again Christians say that they actually did or have shared the gospel at least once in the past year with someone that had different beliefs in the hope that they might accept Jesus Christ. Okay? So first of all, you've got less than 3/4 of born-again Christians that think they even have the responsibility, and then that shifts downward, and only 50% of those so-called born-again Christians would have actually done it. So you can imagine if you were a Roman believer living in Rome in the type of environment that was existing in Rome at that time, how those numbers might even be much less because they were fearful of their life. So Paul's coming in, he's writing these letters, and he's trying to encourage them and said, you know what? You need to be bold. You need to be proud of the gospel, and you need to share it with others. And so, he could try to tear them down. I think if it had been me and, I was really trying to get them riled up, I've often thought, that's why when I was a kid, I thought it'd be great to be a traveling evangelist. You could just hop into church and bam, scream and yell and tell them what they're all doing wrong, and then see you later, and you're out and leave it with the pastor to clean up the mess. But I would probably want to shake people and say, why aren't you sharing your faith? Look at what God's done for you. But Paul looks at it from a positive point. He's more like my wife, and I think he tries to point the positives out. So even though he says it, I'm not ashamed, he's saying, I want you to be proud to share the gospel. And we see these other ways that he specifically states in these verses why we should be proud of the gospel and be willing to share it with others. And the first thing we see as we jump on, he talks about that is the power of God. So if you're following your outline, he's saying, I want you to be proud to share the gospel. Remember, the power of the gospel. Remember the power that's there. And he talks about the power of God. What is the power of God? It's unlimited. God is what? All powerful. What's the word? Omnipotent. You know, the word power in Greek, you know what word we get from it today? Dynamite. How many of you were alive in the 70s and ever watched The Good Times? Wasn't it The Good Times with, what was his name, the tall, skinny guys? Dynamite! Okay. You know, that's what he's saying. It's like, do you realize the power of God that's in the gospel? There's power in it. It's like it's all wrapped up in a single package in the gospel. It's right there. Look at Hebrews 1, verse 3. Hebrews 1, verse 3 says, "The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of His being, sustaining all things by His powerful word. After He had provided purification for sins, He sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven." So he's talking about Jesus, and Jesus has been now sitting at the right hand of the Father, but he reminds us that Jesus, who is the exact representation of the Father, sustains all things by His powerful word. What does that mean, sustains all things? That word talks about maintaining all things, keeping everything going. And I think the most beautiful example of that is He is keeping the moon in orbit so that you and I can walk around. If He for a split second forgets that the moon needs to stay in orbit, you and I are going to start floating up around everywhere. Okay? He keeps everything, even everything that's functioning the way it should in our bodies. He sustains all things. Without Him, that there is nothing. There is power, the power of God, the power of Jesus Christ, the power of His Word that is at the very nucleus, the very core of the gospel. And Paul's saying, boy, you realize what you've been given to share? This isn't like you're trying to sell vacuum cleaners to somebody that doesn't have electricity or that has dirt floors. Which that reminds me of a great little side point here, a little joke, okay? A vacuum cleaner salesman, because I know some of you need a little help in waking you up here this morning, okay? Vacuum cleaner salesman was so excited about his new vacuum cleaner that he could sell. So he was out in the country, West Texas, okay, way out there, and he's going door to door, and he comes in and he has this nice little housewife, this little farm wife open the door, and he says, "Ma'am, I've got the greatest thing for you." And he just charges right in, and she's like, "Oh, no, let me show you. This vacuum cleaner is the best ever. Let me show you. I'm going to just," and he picks up a bucket that he's carrying with him filled with ashes and dirt, and he just throws it all over her floor. And he says, "I'm going to show you how amazing this vacuum cleaner is." He says, if it doesn't just kick it all up and just take care of it, I'll eat all those ashes. And the lady looks at him and says, "Well, you better get to eating because we don't have electricity here." Okay? Problem was, he was convinced, but he didn't have the power to really help him finish the sale. The point is, with us, we have the power. It is the power of God in this gospel. It's not about us. It's not about us convincing people. God does the work. God does the convincing. We just need to be proud of it and share it with people. Well, the next thing, as we look on down these verses and we see the point that it says that brings salvation to everyone who believes. Paul says, be proud of the gospel. Remember that the gospel brings salvation. This is a pretty good thing to present to others. It's life-changing. It's life-altering. It brings salvation to everyone who believes. Yes, brings salvation. But Romans 5:6, first of all. You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. See the key word there? We were powerless. We were doomed. Paul will share later in just a couple of verses, a couple of chapters in Romans, that we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. It means we were powerless. We were doomed. The wages of sin, he says, is death. Separation from God. We had no hope. We had no power. But at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. And that is what brings salvation. Why did Jesus die? We were powerless, but what does that mean? Look at Luke 19, verse 10. I love this verse. For the Son of Man came to what? Seek and to save what was lost. What does it mean to be lost? Why don't we use that? You know, sometimes people say, well, that's just such a negative thing. But the reality, there's not a better word. Because without God, we are lost. We're going in the wrong direction. We're wandering around like a blind man. John shares it in 1 John about how we were dark. I mean, we couldn't see. Think of a blind person without somebody to guide them or to use a cane, a walking stick. They don't know where they're going. They're lost. They're confused. That's what we were. We were lost, separated from God. But Christ came and sought us. That's another thing at the very core of the gospel, is that it brings salvation. To who? Well, the next thing he addresses, he said, you should be proud of the gospel, because remember that the gospel is for everyone who believes. It's available to everybody. It's not for a certain group of people. That's why he specifically says the Jew first and then for the Gentile. He's not talking about that they get priority. It was just they were the first ones to hear about it. But now the Gentiles, every non-Jew, not just the Greeks, but everybody that isn't a Jewish person. So it's everybody. It's all inclusive here. But look at Ephesians 2:8-9. To everyone who believes. For it is, read this verse with me, will you? For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith. And this not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. How many times do you think you've read that verse, those verses over the years, or heard a preacher use them? I want you to notice something. Saved through faith, comma, and that not of yourselves, comma, it is the gift of God. Even faith is a gift of God. Even our ability to believe is God's grace and gift. And Paul, as he discusses these things all in a nutshell, will continue to address even that in the verses and the chapters to come. So to everyone who believes, but he specifically points out, as I just did, that it's without distinction. It's not just for the Jews, or it wasn't just for the Gentiles. Okay? But it's for everybody. Everybody who would believe. Not based on who we are, not based on our bloodline, not based on if we're from a wealthy family or if we're born poor. You know, sometimes we think, yes, we're a little more blessed from being born in the States with opportunities more so than those who might be born in Mexico or even other countries. But the reality is that salvation is for everybody, and that's why we can go out and we should be proud to share that with everybody, because it's not just for a select group of people. It's like the story of a young man who applied in Boston at a nice, famous bank, or a well-thought-of bank, for a job. And he went in and he applied for the job. He gave him all his background, and then he gave his previous jobs and the references. So the president of the bank had somebody contact his previous employer to ask for a reference letter. And this is what he received. The investment house that he had worked at wrote back and said, "Oh, he's a fine young man. His father was a Cabot. His mother was a Lowell. Further back was a happy blend of Saltonstalls and Peabodys and others of Boston's first families. Oh, he's from an incredible lineage. We highly recommend him. A few days later, the president of the bank had them return a letter and say, I'm sorry, but you didn't supply the information that we needed. It was inadequate. We are not contemplating using the young man for breeding purposes. Not really sure that's going to carry over quite the same in Spanish, but we're going to work at that. Okay. You see, God doesn't care what kind of family lineage we come from. And if we've got good bloodline, if we are successful, if we're in a great career, if we've made something of our lives, salvation is for everyone. And that's why you and I should be proud to proclaim it. Well, as we move along, next set in the verses that we're reading here in verse 17 says, For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. What is Paul saying here? He's saying, you know what? We need to be proud to share the gospel. Why? Remember, the gospel brings righteousness. The gospel brings righteousness. I love the phrase there when he says, the righteousness of God is revealed. This is an important term, this term righteousness. It may be the single most important term that we will see in our study of Romans. It's used over 60 times in these 16 chapters in Romans. But the Bible's standard of righteousness is somewhat different than the world's standard of righteousness. It's the Bible standard of righteousness that Paul is referring to here is God's perfection. What is righteous? God. Perfection. Without blemish, without stain, without spot, without sin. So for us, even if we have one sin in our life, we are unrighteous. Maybe the rest of the world would say, oh, you're such a good guy, you do all these great things, you're such a, you're helping people all the time, you're doing these wonderful things. In the world's standard of righteous, perhaps all of us, even without God, would be considered righteous. But the Bible's standard of righteousness is God's perfection. How are we doing on that? But by the grace of God, because of Jesus, we are declared righteous when we call out on Him. And so His righteousness is revealed in us. Okay? 2 Corinthians 5:21. God made Him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in Him we might what? Become the righteousness of God. So when Paul says here that the righteousness of God is revealed, he's not saying, oh, it's been a secret for all these years. But now because Jesus has come, you can understand righteousness. No, he's talking about that the very righteousness of God is revealed in us. We become the righteousness of God. We become perfect in God. We have all the different ways that we've heard that. People are washed by the blood, and so they're cleansed. We see in Revelation that we're going to be wrapped in clothing that is white, pure. But the reality is, once we have Christ come into our life, we are declared, we are seen as righteous. The very righteousness of God is revealed in us. I like how Galatians 2:20 says it. When Paul says, for I am crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. The life I live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. You see, when we accept Christ, we are being crucified with him. We are dead. We become dead and we rise again just as he did. We're resurrected into righteousness. And that's how it's revealed in us. Not revealed to us, like some secret that all of a sudden we're told. But it's actually the righteousness is revealed in us. And then he talks about those two last phrases, by faith from first to last. Again, he reminds us, just as he said, you receive salvation to everyone who believes. How do we receive the righteousness of God? Again, by faith. By faith in him. And as we live in that faith, from faith to faith to faith to faith, the righteousness of God continues to be revealed in us. What an incredible thing to be proud of. To let people know, not to go around and say, hey, you see the righteousness here? But rather to remind people that we've all fallen short of God's glory. And the wages of sin of death, we've been separated from God. We don't have a chance. But when we were powerless, Jesus came, died for us. And the gospel is a story of how if we will call out on him, that the very righteousness of God is revealed in each and every one of us. That he sees us as righteous. That's why when in Revelation, when we see at the end, if our name is written where? In the book of life. There's not going to be a trial and each one of us is going to be sitting there going, I hope I was good enough. And we're going to look back and see everything and look at everything. No. It's simply going to look in the book of life and say, yep, you're here. Ellen and I went to the drama, the fundraiser the other night in Phoenix. We showed up at the front door. We didn't have a ticket. But our name was written right there on the book. And so we were allowed to come in. They didn't ask for 4 forms of identification and all sorts of things. They just said, okay, it's the same. Our name is written there. What an incredible thing to share with each other. And then he kind of throws a little highlight here when he says the righteous will live by faith. He's referring to a passage back in Habakkuk 2:4. You have that? Habakkuk 2:4? No? Well, basically, it's the passage from which this comes from, this saying, where Habakkuk is God is telling him that, see, if he is puffed up, his desires are not upright. He's talking about those that have done what displeases God. But he says, but the righteous will live by his faith. Abraham, and Paul refers to this in Galatians, as well as the author of Hebrews refers to this same passage, the righteous will live by faith, to remind us that Abraham was justified by his faith. This is not something new. This idea of being made righteous by faith is not something that came and started with Jesus. Because it was a promise even to the very first of God's people when Abraham was justified by his faith. David was justified by his faith. God's telling Habakkuk here that those who will live by faith are justified. Those who believe that God was going to provide a way, that he would send the Messiah, and the Messiah would take care of that. This is not something new. That's why a lot of people, when they tell me, oh, the Old Testament, I don't even know why we have it anymore. I mean, everything changed with Jesus. No. Jesus is just the fulfillment of what all the Old Testament was about. It's the same promise. And so Paul here is reminding these, in case there's some Jewish people here as well, that, hey, this isn't something new. The righteous will live by faith. Our righteousness, our justification before God is given to us by faith. What does this all mean? As we look at this and we read these verses again, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Paul is saying, be proud, friends, to share the gospel, no matter what what the consequences may be in your mind, that people are going to laugh at you, they're going to ridicule you, they're going to say you're judgmental. I mean, how many of us have heard that? I'm not judgmental. All I can tell you is the Bible says that Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but through me. There is no other way to the Father. Or Jesus is a liar. Or he's crazy. But the Bible says it. I'm not the one saying it. And I want you to come to the Father with me. And I should be proud to share with you any and all times how to do that. If they don't receive it, that's okay. But Paul's saying, don't be ashamed. Be proud to share your faith. Remember what the gospel includes. There's power in it. It'll change people's life. It brings salvation. It keeps people from keeping and going lost and winding up in the pits of hell. Remember that it's available for everyone. You don't have to go, oh, are you good enough to hear it? Are you, what? Can you give me your background? Just tell everybody. And remember that it brings righteousness. It's life-changing. Don't be ashamed to share the gospel. Don't be ashamed to tell people what you believe. Remember what's in it. You got a good product. You have a great product. Get out there and share it with people. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this morning. Again, the privilege to be here. Thank you for each and every person here. Father, I always pray for the Sundays, and I know that whoever is in these seats, that you ordained us all to be together on any particular Sunday years ago. And you allowed our paths to take all the different routes that we could have taken through life to somehow wind